Right? You don't have to specify that which gets left out. And if you understand history, that won't shock you. Plus, you'd also understand that America has a long history of saying all and not meaning it. That's why all lives matter is not a comeback. It's not a rebuttal. It's absurdity. Right? We have a long history of saying all and leaving out certain people. Thomas Jefferson, right, said what? All men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, among those life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But when he wrote those pretty words, he owned about 237 human beings, as I recall, so I'm figuring he didn't believe his own rhetoric. But it was pretty rhetoric. He just didn't really mean it, right? And then when the Pledge of Allegiance got written in the 1880s, it was redone in the 20s, it was redone again in the 1950s, but every iteration has ended with the same words. What are those words? With liberty and justice for all. There's that word again, all, but they didn't mean it. They didn't mean it in the 1880s, they didn't mean it in the 1920s, and they certainly didn't mean it in the 50s. So until all actually includes all, white folks are just going to have to back off and let black folks say black, and we need to say it with them. You understand? That's the reality of the situation. You have to specify that which has been left out. But again, if you don't have a clear understanding of the history of law enforcement in black communities, all of that will seem radical to you. Whereas if you do have that understanding, it won't seem radical at all. It'll just seem banal and obvious, right? Because at least, see, here's the thing, black folks know some of this history because they've lived it. So black folks know that policing traces directly to what? Slave patrols. That's the first iteration of law enforcement in this country that they experienced. And they know that it was law enforcement that enforced the slave codes, and it was law enforcement that enforced segregation. It was cops and jailers, members of law enforcement, that opened up the jail cells and let black folks out into the hands of the mob to string them up from trees, right? It was police who enforced segregation. It was police that pulled those protesters off of the stools at the Woolworths in Greensboro and Nashville and all throughout the South. It wasn't just random white folks. It was white folks with badges and guns and the power of the state. That doesn't mean all cops are bigots. It doesn't mean all cops are racist. It doesn't mean all cops are brutal. It means that the history of policing with black folks is a little different than the history that many of the rest of us have experienced. Because for African Americans, police were not the folks who came and got your cat out the tree. They were not the folks who came and gave little Johnny a ride around in the neighborhood just to show him how gosh darn exciting it was to be a policeman. That's not the history of law enforcement in black space, right? They know that it was law enforcement and is law enforcement that enforces the war on drugs, which I beg to remind you was never a war on drugs. We know it was not a war on drugs, is not a war on drugs, because it's not drugs being targeted, it's certain people being targeted, specifically black and brown people, because the data tells us what? That white folks use drugs, possess drugs, and sell drugs at the same or higher rates than people of color do, contrary to popular belief, and yet we know that black and brown folks are 4 to 5 times more likely to be arrested for weed, for instance, and prosecuted for it and sent to prison. We know we live in a country and you live in a state where you got lots of white folks becoming weed millionaires, while black folks are still sitting in prison, brown folks still sitting in prison for selling the same product, just didn't have enough money to get an occupational license and a storefront. So they're doing time and other folks are getting rich selling weed that comes with tasting notes, y'all. Because the rich went to them and said, if these people get free, if these people get free, if these people get free, they're gonna take your job. No, fool, they already have your job. That is the point. If you gotta charge $1 a day to work on the farm and the guy that owns the plantation can get the black dude to do it for free because he owns them, guess who got the job? Free got the job, Jack, not you. So as a matter of fact, poor white people would have been better off joining with poor black people to overthrow these rich white folks, take all their stuff, jack all their property, and create a new system. But you made them afraid, see? You created the fear that they are the enemy. Rich white people telling not rich white people that their enemies are black and brown. Same thing going on today with immigration. If we can just build that wall, the jobs will come back. For real, is that how you think capitalism works? For real, is that how you think capitalism works? You just build a wall, and then all the bosses of America are like, oh, they figured it out. We were going to keep taking advantage of them, but they figured it out. They built the wall. Now I got to give everybody a raise. It's not how it works. The wall doesn't stop the capitalist from sending the money overseas. It doesn't stop the owner from building the plant in Sri Lanka. The wall does not exist in cyberspace and stop the transfer of money into Cayman Island bank accounts, right? Capital will always be moving. Goods will always be moving. If you allow capital to move in search of the highest rate of return, and you allow goods to move in search of the highest price, but you don't allow labor to move in search of the highest wages, guess what? You have tilted the game permanently against workers and in favor of capital. That is basic Econ 101. It is not complicated, and it is not arguable, and yet these folks are afraid that if they don't build the wall, their opportunities will diminish, when in fact, working people on both sides of that line and on all sides of all borders would be better off with labor mobility, allowing the working class to increase in its militancy and its demands for better labor conditions, better wages, better benefits all across the continent and all across the world. But see, we've been made afraid of the other, and we don't know our history, and so we ignore that. There's one more thing that makes this possible, though, this trap that we fall into.